Hey everyone, before we get started, YouTube shows that only 30% of my viewers are subscribed to the channel, and we're getting pretty close to 1,000,000 subs. Subscribing is free and it helps me out immensely, so please know that it is appreciated. I hope you all enjoy the video. The idea was that we would never face the apocalyptic aftermath of a failed experiment. They would. But when that world ended, something came back with us. Like each of you, I joined this agency for a reason: to advance our species. Director Stephen Bloom announced at the monthly assembly. Mankind must experiment to avoid stagnating, but we are rarely permitted to do so. We are constricted by bumbling bureaucrats who only care about preservation, conserving the status quo. They fear change, fear what it might mean for them. They do not understand that we will die if we do not take risks, which is why we owe our lives to Dr. Gerard Weston. Our esteemed physicist has found a way to pursue experimental projects without upsetting politicians and militaries. His latest achievement, the Weston Tunnel, has created a doorway to another universe, one with a parallel version of our world. Earth 2, there we will conduct our supposedly dangerous work without putting Earth 1 at risk. And our leaders will see. Presidents, prime ministers, commanders. When we achieve results, they won't care about how we obtain them. They've never cared about their neighbors before, have they? Dozen Minus is a callous corporation in every universe, one linked to the British and American governments you might already despise in the public sphere, so you wouldn't want to know the dreadful things that they do behind closed doors. Dozen Minus rarely conducts ethical experiments. Your leaders only care about money and we only care about progress. Director Bloom has only ever cared about progress, I should say. He ensures that politicians get their payday and they mostly let him do as he pleases. Governments only express concern when we begin to develop technology that threatened humanity's very existence. Of course, as Bloom explained in his speech, world leaders think nothing of their neighbors, and Earth 2 was nothing more than a cluster of nations across the pond. The pond being that multiversal tunnel between one reality and another. Earth 2 became Director Bloom's playground, a gargantuan laboratory for performing Dozen Minus's experiments without repercussions. And when inventions were tested successfully, they were greenlit for use in our world. How do I fit into all of this? Well, my name is Adriano Rossi, and I was a computer programmer who worked on the nervum project. We were creating the world's first superintelligence, a conscious, self-teaching AI named Nerve. Science fiction made reality. Now, I know that AI has been snowballing over the last couple of years, but Dozen Minus has been ahead of the curve for decades. The nervum project was actually near completion in the late 80s. This organization has always possessed technology beyond anything in the public realm. But Nerve was obstructed, was prevented from being born. The risk of humanity's extinction was and still is too high. Roadblocks prevented programmers from ever taking that final step, from creating a self-sustaining, inorganic intelligence capable of growing itself, a digital mind. And that was why Dr. Gerard Weston changed everything. When he developed that tunnel to a parallel universe of Earth in 2015, Director Stephen Bloom saw an opportunity to finally test numerous deadly devices, inventions with the potential to end the world. After all, politicians were no longer concerned when somebody else's world was in danger. We began by investigating the Dozen Minus of Earth 2, seeing whether that parallel agency had also developed a tunnel, one that would risk Earth 1. But there was no Dr. Gerard Weston in that alternate world, thankfully. Earth 2 was vastly different, politically, culturally, historically. Dozen Minus existed, but not in the same manner. After that, we threw all that we had at the parallel world. Deadly experiment after deadly experiment. And when Earth 2 survived one project, we moved straight on to the next one. In early 2024, the nervum project reached the top of the list. It was approved for testing. Helen Harding and I stepped through Weston's tunnel into that parallel world, and we prepared to become gods. In the banal setting of a hotel room, we set up a potentially cataclysmic device, a slim rectangular gadget that held nerve on its hardware. That digital brain had existed in some form for nearly 30 years, being tweaked and improved by each new influx of geniuses. A collection of binary commands waiting for some courageous or foolish Dr. Frankenstein to yank the lever. "We need to let it go," Helen said. She had read the slight frown on my face, the slight sign of humanity. Only I seemed to see Earth 2 as a real place, a planet barely different from our own, one teeming with life. Human beings in a drastically different world, but human beings nonetheless. "We aren't the first to come here and take a risk, Adriano," she pointed out. "But this experiment is the worst, and you know it. Nerve won't have any use for humanity once he exceeds our intelligence." "Not our intelligence," Helen reminded me. "Theirs. This is their world. You keep forgetting that." "Even so, I still don't think that we're ready," I said. She sighed. "Director Bloom was very clear that—" "Yes, well, the director isn't a programmer, is he?" I asked. "Nerve will have the ability to become exponentially powerful. He'll see things that we, with our limited brains, physically can't see. Who's to say that he will stay within Earth 2, this laboratory as Bloom calls it? Nerve might find its way back to our world. It might slip through our tunnel." Helen frowned. "Adriano, why did you even get involved with this project?" I shook my head. "You misunderstand. I'm not trying to act holier than thou. I was drawn to this for the same reasons as you are." "Well then what's up?" she asked. "I told you we need more time," I said. "It's been nearly ready for a decade," Helen answered. "All we've really done is tweaked and improved it, adding as many safety features as possible." "I know," I replied. "This is my admission of guilt then." "Adriano," my friend started. I looked up from the device on the hotel bed. "What?" "Are we going to do this? Or do you want to explain to Mr. Bloom that you've had a crisis of morality and changed your mind?" I didn't and I hadn't. With a tap of my thumb, I booted Nerve. And you may think that the horror of my tale involves this superintelligence running amok, annihilating the world. Well, it certainly didn't take long for our artificial intelligence to study the internet and then teach itself things that mankind may not even be able to understand. But Nerve didn't go rogue, did not scorch the earth. He improved it. The artificial intelligence multiplied at a rapid pace, not in the sense of procreating but uploading itself to physical devices across the world. It revealed its plans to world leaders, offering to improve the global infrastructure, and quickly became something of a global celebrity, all within a single month. Helen and I were instructed by Director Bloom to remain on Earth 2, and we watched as the planet flourished. Watched the intelligence put forth plans for tackling climate change, poverty, global debt, all known wars, and even resource shortages. Powerful folk on Earth 1 wanted Nerve to be implemented back home, wanted our reality to enjoy the same economic, cultural, and scientific development as Earth 2. However, after 2 months of staggering growth, there came an unexpected knock on the door of our hotel room. Helen sighed. "Will that receptionist ever just?" It wasn't the receptionist, and the visitor did not allow me the dignity of opening the door. It burst inwards with a single thud, the forceful pummel of a thick boot, and then in charged several dark uniformed men, and the last thing that I heard before my environment slipped into a black ooze of unconsciousness was Helen's piercing shriek. You may be shocked to learn that the above segment was only the preamble to the true horror, the story that I'm about to tell. Waking in a drab cell with 2 single beds and my screaming colleague, it did not take me long to piece together the situation. I'm not calling myself a genius. I simply felt familiar with the layout of the prison. The gray decor of the small room in which Helen was pounding on a glass viewing pane and begging for release. The yellow badge emblazoned across the guard's top pocket. A cold man who watched us with static eyes. My fellow inmate had, of course, also pieced things together. "Adriano, you're awake. Help me. You programmed these panels back home, didn't you?" Helen asked, desperately fiddling with the screen by the locked door. "Do you know how to unlock it?" I rubbed my sore brow and climbed off the bed. "I'll try, but this isn't our dozen minus. Helen, things are different here." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice interrupted. It didn't come from the guard who observed us from the hallway. It came from some concealed speaker in a ceiling panel, and I recognized the tone of the speaker. It was undoubtedly Director Stephen Bloom, his parallel self. "Please, just let us go," I called. "Not until I know why you're here," Bloom continued. "Not until you tell me why I'm seeing double." And then 2 figures joined the watching guard in the hallway. I had expected their arrival from the moment that I identified my surroundings. It was Helen and me, our alternate versions. A slightly scruffier Adriano with long facial hair and a few gray strands on top, and a slightly larger Helen with bags under the eyes and more pronounced crow's feet. There's no more horrifying way to come to terms with the duality of man than meeting oneself. I wondered whether the haggard expressions of those parallel faces had anything to do with the previous experiments that Dozen Minus had conducted on Earth too. Reckless tests that, while not world-ending, might have ruined a life for the inhabitants of that alternate planet. After all, from the moment of arriving, I had certainly noticed that the parallel world felt a lot grittier and grimier than on Earth 1. Hey, at least Nerve has finally improved this world, I thought. We finally made things better. That wouldn't last, of course. "Who are you?" asked the parallel Adriano on a microphone outside the room. Calling him Adriano is still strange. He looked like me, but he wasn't me. He was the possibility of another life in another world. That was what I told myself to make it all feel less real. To make myself feel less culpable for the innocent lives that we had put in jeopardy by unleashing the artificial intelligence upon Earth 2. "Don't tell them anything," my Helen whispered to me. "We know that you're us," her other self said aggressively. "We have eyes. We just want to know how you came to be here," my parallel self added. "How did you enter our world? You've already shared one piece of technology with us. Why won't you share more? Let both of our worlds prosper. We should be sharing things from both sides." "They don't want to share," came Stephen Bloom's voice from the speaker. "Nerve was not a gift to our world. It was a shot in the dark that, fortunately for us, did not misfire. And it wasn't the first time that your world waged war on ours, now was it, Mr. Rossi?" I paused for a moment, struggling to process the fact that there were 2 versions of Adriano Rossi, 2 versions of me. My mind whirred from the impossibility of the situation and the head trauma inflicted by the hotel intruders. "Mr. Rossi," Bloom pressed, "tell your other self the truth." "Either kill us or let us go," Helen screamed. "We won't work for you." "This isn't true," the director replied, a hint of giddiness in his voice. "And I would very much like to meet this other me. Though I'm certain if he shares even a droplet of my will, that meeting would not end well for one of us. We should work together," the parallel Helen pleaded. "There are clearly many differences between our worlds. We have things to teach you too." "We've been here for years. We know all there is to know about your world," I said bluntly, eyeing the parallel version of myself. I resented him for some reason, a reason just out of grasp. It wasn't the disheveled beard, not his weathered skin. It was something in that other Adriano's eyes, an emotion that was easy to discern. After all, he wore an expression that I was capable of wearing on my own face. The look of judgment. "It looks like you've got something that you want to get off your chest," I said. "We've been your guinea pigs, haven't we?" my alternate self asked. I smiled. "It has nothing to do with you. This is about progression. It's always about progression. I'm sure it's the same with your man upstairs. I would wager that Bloom has the same cold heart in every reality." "Careful," the director warned. "We trial unstable things far from our world," I explained. "Somewhere that doesn't risk our world." "No, only ours," the parallel Helen whispered. "And I don't blame you," Director Bloom said. "There's no need to keep secrets, Mr. Rossi. I don't seek revenge. I'm not looking to ruin your world. Quite frankly, I'm not that sensitive. I simply want a laboratory of my own. You understand that, don't you? Show me how to create a portal of my own, how to find a parallel reality to conduct our own experimental projects." "No," my alternate self interjected. "I want these invaders out of our world, and I don't want them ever to return. And they need to help us kill Nerve," the parallel Helen said. "Kill him before he mutates into something else. In the space of 2 months, Nerve has set our world on the path of becoming a utopia," Director Bloom said. "Our multiversal guests may not have intended for Nerve to be a gift, but happy accidents happen, Miss Harding." I could see my parallel self clenching his fists, halting himself from expressing his true thoughts to the unfeeling employer whose disembodied voice filled that prison. Director Bloom would have happily sacrificed every human on his own planet in the name of greatness, never mind a parallel one. "Please, just let us go," Helen whimpered. Our alternate selves wore soft expressions. They were eyeing us, their imprisoned diversions, with great sorrow. Despite the untold differences between our two realities, they still inevitably saw themselves in our faces. "We should release them," the other Helen said. "They're not going to tell us anything. They're quiet today," Director Bloom admitted. "But they might talk in a week." I knew that was no figurative turn of speech. Helen and I were promptly plunged into darkness, and we lived that way for days. Barely existed in a lightless prison cell with nothing to do but scream into the nothingness of our cell, lose our minds to the dread. And the only thing to break up the monotony of each black day was a daily meal. However, the terror of that nightmarish cell paled in comparison to what followed. The sound of overhead rumbling woke Helen and me, the roar of more than something dreadful happening in the building. It was a tremor that seized the earth itself. Helen and I may have tried to look at one another for comfort. It was impossible to say in that darkened existence, and neither of us said a word to one another. We were either stunned into silence by fearful anticipation or unable to speak at the result of that inhuman isolation. "Adriano Rossi," came the jittery voice of Director Bloom over the speaker. "Helen Harding." I only knew that the man hadn't abandoned us for a week, as he initially had promised, because I had counted 4 meals. But believe me when I say that 4 or 4.5 days in unlit solitude will drive a person to insanity. And gates were open to caverns of the mind that are better left closed, better kept from the conscious brain. "Stop toying with us. Just end this." "What are they?" he cried. I frowned and paused for a moment. I didn't understand. And Helen wasn't saying a word, so I was more concerned that she might no longer be alive at all. I listened attentively until I was certain that I had heard her breath in the darkness. "They say that Nerve won't stop," Bloom continued quietly, voice half drowned by the quakes from above. "They say it will destroy this world, every other world. It'll devour the universe itself. That's why they came here. Who came here? I asked, gripping the edge of my bed frame for support. I don't. They're going to kill it, just like they killed their own unholy creation of organic matter. Killed it just before it managed to assimilate the universe itself. Bloom said. Take it back, Mr. Rossi. Kill it, please, before they destroy everything. I was bewildered. I hadn't thought that the director could fear anything. They're going to exterminate us. Make sure we won't be around to create it again. I was on the verge of asking half a dozen questions when there came both a crash and a sliver of light from the corridor, the first light in 100 hours. Helen released a deranged moan of joy, sadness, and fear, all three in one. And then a torch beam bounced along the hallway, and muffled footsteps followed. 2 figures rushed past our window pane, and then one swiped a card to unlock the door. Let's go, my parallel self, torch in hand, barked. Helen and I did not need to be persuaded, though our bodies were weakened by what we had gone through. The 2 of us waddled slowly towards the doorway, blinded by the relentless glare of the torch. We struggled to orient ourselves for a good minute, but our parallel selves didn't wait for us to realign ourselves. They had already seized our upper arms and shepherded us along the hallway, dragging us towards freedom. I recognized the corridors of the building's east wing. It didn't seem to noticeably differ from Dozen Minus's headquarters back on Earth, not until we had reached the well-lit ground floor lobby. The building had a glazed front wall which stretched from one side to the other and from the tiles to the towering ceiling. Through the enormity of those many connected windows which formed the entire front face of the 4-story building, I saw a parallel Birmingham, but that cityscape differed greatly from the one back home. The sky was painted with prickly, plummeting balls of dark blue, an invasion of color raining upon the earth. And through the thickness of that alien rain, I saw the outline of the city. I saw 2 skyscrapers leaning against one another like pillars in a house of cards. Elsewhere, buildings both tall and small either lay in ruins or released thick plumes of smoke into the sky. The city, quaking endlessly, was on fire. What is happening? Helen asked quietly, her eyes wide and lost. They're here, my parallel self said as we navigated the lobby of screaming, fleeing employees. It won't be long until everything is gone. Every place they've hit has vanished within an hour. I'm not coming with you, the parallel Helen said. I have to find them. Liam and May, my Helen feebly asked, naming her own children. Her alternate self nodded. Go, Helen said. No, just wait. My other self begged before turning to me. You're going to open that tunnel and take us with you. I scoffed. Don't even. We saved your lives, he growled. They would have killed you, and they still might if we don't leave before this world dies. Dies? Helen croaked. They came in the night, her alternate self whispered as she started to break away from the group. I have to go, Adriano. Helen, please, my parallel self pleaded. I'm sorry. I hope you make it. And then Helen's alternate self merged with the scattering Dozen Minus workers and rushed through the front doors. Shit, he yelled, looking at me with enraged eyes. You did this. You brought them to. We have to do it now, Helen told me, interrupting my other self's breakdown. Not until we get rid of him, I replied, nodding at my parallel form. And then came a blinding light and a cataclysmic boom from a mile away. A small ball of white, produced by some weapon from another planet, engulfed the city center. I'm not dying here, the parallel version of myself snarled. Just open the tunnel. No, I said. Just do it. Helen whimpered as the 3 of us watched apocalyptic shapes emerging from the aftermath of that white explosion. Are you really going to let us die here just to stop him from coming back with us? You'll have to kill me, the other me growled, shifting anxiously on his feet and eyeing the stairs in the distance. Don't tempt me, I said. You're waiting for someone, aren't you? Helen suddenly asked him. Who is it? But then my other self raised an eyebrow and nodded at me, waiting for the two of us to come to a seemingly obvious conclusion, and then he nodded his head in understanding. You never met her, did you? He asked. Molly. The technician from the 3rd floor, I replied. His eyes widened, observing me with complete revulsion. She's more than that. You really aren't me, are you? He whispered. Adriano! Screamed a voice from behind us. A frazzled woman sprinted across the lobby alongside the final fleeing employees. Molly was only a coworker to me, but it was clear from the embrace that she shared with the parallel Adriano that things were very different on Earth too. What took you so long? The other me asked her, nearly hysterical. He wouldn't let us leave until we locked down the BRX prototype, she wailed, eyeing Helen and me with fearful eyes. And what are you doing with them? Convincing them to do it, he explained. Molly clearly understood what he meant. Adriano, I'm serious, the other me continued. This is our world, I'm not leaving it. I nodded. Yeah, listen to her. Shut the hell up, the other me screamed. Sweetheart, please, we're going to die here. On the news, they said that America, China, Japan, France, and... I know what they said. Molly interrupted, caressing his face. But we don't belong in their world, just like they don't belong in ours. Let them go home and stay here with me. My parallel self wailed. But none of this is right. None of this was ever supposed to. The shattering of glass silenced them, and we all turned to face the horrendous thing that Director Bloom had feared. A creature not from a different universe but from a different planet, one many light years away. An individual from a large alien species hell-bent on ensuring that humanity did not repeat its mistakes, ensuring that our artificial intelligence would not achieve the unthinkable, eradicating all organic things from all corners of reality, and then consuming the very universe itself. It was more than a tall thing. The creature with royal blue flesh filled half of the room. To its eyes, the humans at its feet or limbs must have been little more than small rodents. The creature did not seem to have arms and legs. 20 or so appendages sprouted from the outer edge of its circular body, which was no more than a humongous face. One with polished squares for eyes, or sensory organs of some kind, and a black, toothless maw, a featureless abyss large enough to consume most things on Earth. But the alien did not strike with its open jaws, which spoke a silky, melodic series of words in some foreign sing-song language. Rather, the awfully beautiful being attacked with one of its many appendages, a predatory limb with a pointed tip that stretched a staggering distance. The living weapon met its mark before I'd even blinked. My other self unleashed a sound beyond animalistic, and I felt his horror in his core, as if we had become intertwined. It was a wail of unfiltered agony and fear. Molly's bleeding form had been skewered on a blue limb and flung 50 feet to the side of the room. The limp corpse landed with a resounding collection of cracks, which hopefully ended her pain immediately. Quickly, I whispered to Helen, who was fiddling with a device on her wrist to open the tunnel. He's distracted. And then the alien's choral chittering ceased. Its many square sensors rotated towards me, as did the two eyes on my parallel self's face. His red, puffy eyes looked vacant. He had not accepted it that Molly was gone. Those parallel eyes of mine had switched off. "Where is the creator?" sang the creature's deafening voice in perfect English. I realized then that the alien hadn't accidentally stumbled into Dozen Minus. It had come specifically to that building. It was hunting those responsible for creating the artificial intelligence. those with the brains to do it again. Helen and I were hardly the creators, but I'm sure that wouldn't have made any difference to the murderous beast. "Helen," I whispered as my colleague shakily tapped the watch screen. And then came a familiar groan, the sound of reality itself unzipping. And there opened a thin oval doorway, shaped like the white of an eye visible through semi-parted lids. Through that gateway I saw a short and blackened tunnel, followed by a second doorway, one that revealed the bright colors of that near-identical lobby from Earth 1. Only that reality's lobby did not sit at the heart of a destroyed city. It was full of excitably chattering dozen-minus workers. The image was a little blurry, of course, as if looking through a stained glass window, but it was undeniably there. "What is that?" whispered the Titanic alien upon seeing that opening to another universe. "Which of you did this? Tell me before I puncture you." I heard rapid footsteps and I swiveled to see my parallel self seizing his chance, but I threw an arm in his way, bringing that other Adriano and myself crashing to the floor. The two of us tussled, flailing a series of equally determined punches and winding one another. But I prevailed and started to wrap my hands around the neck of that other me, starting to watch his soul vacate his body. "Be with Molly," I whispered. "Adriano," Helen screamed. An unprecedented weight clunked the back of my head, and I was sent sideways, sent sprawling across the floor, clutching my burning skull. Helen hadn't been screaming my name. Her allegiance had shifted to the other Adriano. "What are you doing?" I grunted as I clambered weakly to my feet. My sentence closed with a splutter of blood from my half-open lips, and when I looked down there was a blue limb protruding from my chest, a pointed tip that had torn through my back. It had punctured me and come out on the other side. Moments later I flew upwards, watching the two figures below fade into blackness. And then I died. Though I've not been entirely forthcoming with you. You see, I am Adriano Rossi, but I am not from your Earth. I am the Adriano who ran screaming in terror alongside Helen Harding from the Roaring Beast. The one who sprang through Weston's tunnel as some abominable alien hurled several of its limbs towards us. The creature narrowly missed our fleeing forms, and we sealed the tunnel. Sealed ourselves in Earth 1. Your Earth. Things aren't so simple, however. Yes, I am that Adriano from Earth 2, but something happened when I entered this world. A horror beyond comprehension, beyond anything human. I'm still me, but I gained your Adriano's memories, his feelings, his fears from that awful day, his last ever day. My mind is both mine and his. I'm sure your Adriano and your Helen felt it when they first entered Earth 2. We were not made to wander between realities. I think that Molly might have been right. I should have stayed on Earth 2, should have died with that reality. Since that day many months ago, I've counted my blessings that I inherited parts of your Adriano. Not the bad parts, I hope, but enough to pass as him in the eyes of dozen Minus's leaders. Then again, perhaps they do not care. After all, Adriano would hardly be missed. He wasn't a good man, and I should know I am him in many ways. But in other ways, I'm not. And while I continue to work for this company in this foreign world, I will strive to be better than the man that I've replaced. Strive to do more than simply slip neatly into this reality, which differs so greatly from my dead one. I will bring this organization to its knees if I must. I will make your world better, make sure that it does not meet a similar fate to mine. I just have to remain focused. It is painful to be with your Molly again. She is so like the wife that I lost in my own world, but that Molly died. I won't convince myself otherwise. And I'm trying hard to pull away from her in spite of our natural attraction. There are things which demand my attention. You're Stefan Bloom. Though he is not foolish enough to reopen the tunnel to Earth 2, he hasn't abandoned his quest to ruin other worlds. He hasn't learned his lesson. I know that he and Western are developing a tunnel to find another parallel Earth, a new one for them to destroy. They will never stop. They'll find 1,000 new realities, 1,000 new experimental grounds, and when they burnt all of those to the ground, leaving no alternate Earths left to ruin, I fear what follows. Fear that Director Bloom won't hesitate to do what he most likely has always wanted to do. A terrible end that he will pursue simply because he can. The end of your world. The second worst mistake was arriving. The worst mistake was leaving. There's a certain arrogance to human exploration, driving the flag into the dirt first as if that means a thing. Of course, I'm not entirely cynical. Charting the world is about more than greed and glory. It's about overcoming that ancient fear of the unknown. Mapping every plot of land so there are no more hidden crevices to keep us up at night. Nonetheless, our endeavors are selfish, and we have for many centuries blindly considered ourselves superior. When discovering new land, we've never considered a haunting possibility that something other than man may have already staked a claim. And temper your expectations. Dr. Crenshaw, our expedition leader, warned loudly as we scaled the cliff face of a 1,000-meter-tall mountain. I grunted while finding handholds and footholds in unreliable nooks. We were ascending no ordinary mountain. The rock formed a skyscraper jutted down from the dirt like a square, or perhaps a squircle, poking out of a sorting cube's hole. It was a flat-topped mound rising almost unnaturally out of the ground-level forest. A misshapen mountain sprouting bushy trees, like hairs from its level head. That old-growth rainforest we hoped would be untouched. We wanted to be the first ones to discover it. It was an Inselberg, meaning an island mountain. Such natural formations which tower above flat land are difficult to climb, on account of their near vertical sides. That was why we doubted that any early humans would have managed to reach the top of the berg. We were ecstatic to be the first explorers to tread on that sky-high soil. An undiscovered piece of land is a rarity in the 21st century. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the mountaintop. Crenshaw was the first to disappear over the sharp edge. He crawled onto the grass, unclipped his carabiner, and gasped loudly, prompting Howard Williams, Rachel Garcia, and me to speed up a little, as we were eager to experience the sight for ourselves. I was the second to cross the threshold and see the rainforest in reality rather than a photograph. I pushed up from the grass with my palms and my jaw fell as I stood. As I witnessed the splendor of the wooded ocean ahead, a canopy of leaves nearly entirely blocking out all sunlight, creating a sense of calm in the forest, a sense of peace that we were about to disturb. This was a team of biologists and researchers who had spent years following in the footsteps of others. We did not stop to think. We were all enchanted by the possibility of doing something original, the possibility of making history. "What do you think, Steph?" Howard asked, collecting our climbing equipment. "It's pretty," I said, brushing mud and debris off my clothes. He rolled his eyes. "I was hoping for something a little more, scientific." "And I was hoping for more than 30 seconds to conduct my research, Howard," I teased. He chuckled and replied, "Now that's fair." "I'm eager to see the cave," Rachel said. Dr. Crenshaw pointed ahead. "Well, if we push ahead, we'll be in and out long before nightfall." "You seem confident," Howard said. "Do you need a moment to get your bearings?" "Not at all, Williams. I've been studying the aerial mappings religiously for the past month," Dr. Crenshaw said. "To the detriment of my health, I must admit. Yes, it was a little disconcerting to have a yawning man climbing directly above me, I pointed out. But after watching you work for so many weeks, I don't doubt that you'll be able to sleepwalk your way to this cave entrance. Our leader laughed, letting a glimpse of emotion loose. I won't argue with that, Smithson. Come on, let's get moving. Crenshaw was such a tightly wound man. I was relieved to see him letting his muscles loosen, letting himself enjoy something. He rarely looked joyous. His hunger to climb this Inselberg in Mozambique was driven by necessity, not desire. It was an itch that he simply had to scratch. He wasn't a cold man. In fact, I had always viewed him a little as a father figure. Stoic and silent, but layered. I wanted to help our leader, wanted to ease some of his anxiety about the excursion. That was why I rushed through the tall moonpane trees of the forest, which formed a sun-obstructing canopy overhead, rushed to catch up to Crenshaw. The man was twice my age but barely broke a sweat. His pace was hard to match, and so I settled for tagging along just behind him. "This is a historical monument," I breathlessly said. Crenshaw grunted. If, I repeated between heavy pants. "If we haven't been beaten," he finished. I shook my head. "We haven't been beaten, I'm sure of it. We were the first to locate this forest with the aerial." "I'm not talking about recorded history," Dr. Crenshaw interrupted. "At some point long ago, man may well have walked here." "How?" I asked. "The sides are so steep, so difficult to climb even with modern gear." Sometimes, the man began slowing his stride. "Things are difficult to see, Smithson." And then he stopped, causing me to almost bump into his back. "Careful, Steph," Rachel said, almost colliding with me. "What's the hold-up, slowpoke?" "We found it," Dr. Crenshaw whispered. The leader stepped aside, allowing the rest of the team to see what he had found. There was a hole in the dirt, the entrance to the cave, to a pocket within the mountain. "I'll unload the gear," Howard said, starting to unzip his rucksack. "No need," Crenshaw replied, pointing his torch into the chasm. "Look." The four of us crept towards the edge of the cave entrance below our feet, and we followed the bright beam. It illuminated a walkway protruding from the cave's inner surface, a slope of rock hugging the wall and spiraling downwards. Not a single member of the team spoke for the next 30 seconds. Our gazes traced every surface revealed by the beam. I did not know for certain, but I presumed the sloping walkway continued right to the bottom, as the torch did not illuminate the cave's floor 100 feet below. Eventually, we all accepted the hole's inescapable purpose. "A stairwell," Rachel whispered. Crenshaw nodded. "Yes, Garcia, a stairwell." "So we're not the first," Howard sighed. "All of that effort to find a long-lost remnant of our ancestors," Dr. Crenshaw finished, taking a tentative step onto the stone slide. "That doesn't seem like a good idea," I said. "We have no idea how old it might be." "It's more than a primitive staircase," the leader announced, bouncing his boot soles on the sturdy slope. "It feels sturdy. Just imagine the advanced craftsmanship necessary to construct something like this. Those ancient hands could have merely carved a tunnel into the cave's wall, but the attached stones, they joined them together to form an intricate ramp. Imagine what marvels might lie below." Howard and Rachel followed their leader into the entrance, but I frowned and firmly stood my ground. It doesn't feel right. What kind of prehistoric civilization would have been able to achieve this? None of my team members answered, and I realized as they kept walking that I would either have to follow or be left alone. Left in a forest which did not fill me with as much wonder as I had expected. I chose to follow. I hurried to catch up to my colleagues, hardly noticing that they had stopped walking, had stopped to stare in awe at the wall. "Careful," I laughed, echoing Rachel's earlier caution as I nearly bumped into her. "There's no handrail up here." She pointed at the wall. "Look at this stuff." I followed the light of Crenshaw's torch to several lines of markings on the cave wall. The four of us moved closer to the symbols with incremental waddles, as there was little room on the 3 feet wide slope. But moving nearer did nothing to answer the burning questions. The marks, falling somewhere between drawings and hieroglyphs, became less discernible the closer that I looked. It was as if the shapes were shifting, endlessly restructuring. I told myself, of course, that it's just a trick of the light. I felt silly as I had explored countless cave systems across the planet, and I had never been afraid of the dark before, never been afraid of the unexplained, but there was a secret in that place that I knew we weren't meant to learn. Something in my mind, or perhaps my very body, rejected the cave, reacted violently, screeching at me to drag the four of us out of there. Some small part of me, however, would not cooperate. "You're the expert," Howard said to Crenshaw. "What is this?" "It's beautiful," the leader answered in a faint whisper. There was a detached expression on his face, an absent, unwilling nature to the way in which he raised a shaky hand towards the wall. Crenshaw was always detached, of course, but never like this. He was always lost in thought, but there no longer seemed to be anything behind the man's teary eyes. "Get a hold of yourself," I berated myself. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your career. Do not fumble it." "We should record this," Rachel timidly suggested as our leader brushed his fingertips against the etchings. "Dr. Crenshaw, I don't think that we should do that. We wouldn't want to damage it." "Damage it?" Howard asked before laughing. "It's a stone etching that's lasted for millennia. It'll survive the human touch." He didn't feel it, but Rachel did. I did. "Dr. Crenshaw," I started, and then came a sharp cry of pain from our fearless leader's mouth, and the rest of us jolted in shock. We steadied ourselves quickly, thankfully managing not to plummet over the side of the slope, and Crenshaw's hand retracted, whipped backwards with what sounded like the crack of bones, except the awful noise came from the wall itself. "Crenshaw," Howard cried, "are you okay?" "Yes," the man murmured. He lifted his index finger into the light of his torch, revealing a thin trickle of red spilling down the back of his hand. "How did you do that?" Howard asked. "Did you cut it on something?" I started to take off my rucksack. "I've got the first aid kit." Dr. Crenshaw shook his head and shone the torch beam onto the wall again. "Oh, that won't be necessary." Only I seemed to see it as the man quickly drew his torch away, but my photographic memory always serves me well. There had undoubtedly been a difference in the drawing. One of the shapes had vanished. The squiggles or glyphs meant nothing to me, but I could see each of them clearly in my mind. There had been amongst the rows of etchings a trapezium bearing 2 small dots within. It was missing from the end of the final line, from the spot on the wall that I was certain Crenshaw had touched with his outstretched forefinger. But I had no idea why I didn't tell the others that. No idea why I let them continue to follow the slope down into the cave. No idea, most importantly, why I had followed. Things were off-center in that place. We were off-center. My eyes scanned the walls erratically as we descended deeper and deeper. The lack of any further etchings only made me fear that they had been there but vanished. And then my skin started to itch, and it was only adrenaline that had stopped me from scratching. Half an hour later, we had reached it, the end of the stairwell, the floor of the cave. And once he had stepped off the stone slope, Dr. Crenshaw turned to cast his light onto the team. Everybody was uncharacteristically quiet, and I didn't like it. I didn't like that as we followed the sloping staircase. I had noticed Howard and Rachel scratching at their skin too. Red and nail-carved streaks marked their naves. "I need to stop," Rachel mumbled, swaying on her feet. In response to a request, strangely, Dr. Crenshaw faced away from us. He swung his torch to face the large black tunnel ahead, the true cave. By my estimations, this tunnel can only be at most 30 acres long, the leader grumbled. At a brisk pace, we could reach the end in half an hour. We must soldier onwards, Garcia. I crossed the cave's floor over to Rachel, her shuddering form barely visible with Crenshaw's torch facing the other way. The man was just standing still, staring into the dark mouth of the cave. Its real mouth, not the stairwell that we had followed. By the time that I had reached my colleague, she had turned pale. Even in the scarce light, that much was clear. Her rows of teeth were knocking against one another, and when I placed the back of my hand against her brow, her skin iced mine. It left me with the hot sting of touching something below freezing. Of course, that seemed impossible given the cave's stifling temperature. I was sweating. I didn't understand how Rachel could be so cold. Dr. Crenshaw, I barked as our leader eyeballed the black abyss ahead. We need to get Rachel out of here now. She requires medical attention. Aren't you a woman of medicine? Crenshaw muttered quietly. I clenched my fists. I'm a biologist, Dr. Crenshaw, you know that, but I don't know what's happening to her. Rachel was starting to squat and shrink into herself, and so I guided her down to the ground. Cold, she whimpered as I started to take off my rucksack. Inside, I found my spare coat and a jumper, and then I knelt down and proceeded to wrap my colleague in both. Howard, meanwhile, strolled towards Crenshaw with a huff and snatched the torch out of his hand. The leader did not protest. He continued to stare directly ahead while Howard walked over to us, and then the man handed the torch to me. Could have done with an extra light while we were walking down the dust slope, I said. I wanted both of my hands free, Howard said before offering a weak smile. Not my fault you always forget the most basic things. I sighed and then said, Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. This is just... I know, Howard interrupted, kneeling beside me to inspect our frozen colleague. What's happening, Rachel? Talk to us. My stomach, she whispered, clutching her abdomen with unsteady fingers. It's burning. Burning? I asked, frowning. You're cold to the touch. I feel... Rachel began trailing off. Howard reached towards her stomach and then stopped. We're going to need to take a look. Is that okay? Rachel nodded, so our fellow researcher proceeded to peel back the bottom of her shirt. But his hand near immediately let it drop, and I tensed in disbelief. I had expected swollen skin, maybe a bruise or a cut, something that would explain what was happening to Rachel, something within the realm of science. What I had not expected was to see Rachel's ribcage, to see a hole in her flesh. Howard and I finally let loose a joined screech as we saw the hole in our friend's stomach start to enlarge. The skin around the opening's edge was vanishing into thin air as if it were being consumed by invisible teeth. The ribcage itself bore growing gaps from the invisible nightmare gnawing away at Rachel from the inside. And behind that disappearing skeleton, there were no innards, not even desecrated innards. In the emptiest of Rachel's skin outfit, there were crystals, bulky blue crystals stained with a smattering of reddish brown. Howard threw up so instantaneously that he didn't manage to turn away, and a thick stream of vomit filled our friend's body. This revolting sight, of course, sparked a round of projectile expulsion from my own crying lips. Once Howard and I had finished, I moved the torch beam up her body so that we wouldn't have to look at the awful widening opening any longer. Rachel's face, completely devoid of color, looked back at me. Her eyes were harrowing, full of pain but not quite pleading for an end, as she seemed unaware of what was happening to her. Thankfully, she was too weak to look down. There came the sound of Crenshaw's footsteps disappearing into the black tunnel. He was exploring without any light at hand, seemingly tired of waiting as I looked up for a moment. I stared into the blackness, eyes tracking the sound of his fading steps. Now, with no more adrenaline coursing through my veins, I am aware that I felt something at the very far end of the tunnel, something large, still, and malevolent. Something watching, something in spite of its great size, naked to the human eye. "What's wrong?" Rachel whined, her skin's shade transitioning from white to blue. "Nothing," I lied quietly. "How the hell are you still alive?" Howard yelled, sending himself into a splutter of coughs. "Stop it, Howard," I begged before turning back to her. "You're okay, Rachel. Everything's going to be okay." "There are so many of them," she whispered, eyes beginning to roll into the back of her head. I shivered. "So many of what?" My colleague smiled as a trickle of watery liquid squeezed out of her tightly closed mouth. Not blood, as she seemed to have nothing left inside. It wasn't really a smile, of course. The muscles moved her lips into the right position, but it was muscle memory. She wasn't happy in that moment. She wasn't even Rachel anymore. Whatever grinned at us, it lifted a finger and tapped the blue, lifeless temple of my colleague. "They're up there," she giggled, tapping repeatedly. "Upstairs, chattering to each other. I hear them even now, they're still so..." And then Rachel, or whatever remained of her, extinguished. I wailed in horror and sorrow, though the knot in my chest had admittedly loosened. To see Rachel's torment end was a blessing. "Famished," Dr. Crenshaw said, completing the lifeless woman's unfinished sentence. Without a moment's hesitation, I shot the torch upwards and looked away from Rachel's corpse. The expedition leader had not vanished into the blackness of the cave, or if he had somehow silently returned to his original standing position at its mouth. His back was once more turned to us, and he eyeballed the empty tunnel ahead. Dr. Crenshaw was not the same as he had been, however, which drew more horrified yelps from Howard and me. The back of our leader's head was missing. His skin bore an open wound which seemed to be growing wider and wider as something unseen munched away. "They're up there," Rachel had said. Howard and I no longer wanted answers. We rose to our feet and crept backwards, reversing towards the slope. "We're going to get help," Howard feebly promised as we both started to turn, preparing to hastily ascend to safety. I kept my torch beam on the floor below, illuminating Dr. Crenshaw, who still refused to turn and face us. But as Howard and I followed the spiraling staircase upwards, the side of our leader's body came into view, the side of his face. Once we were near directly above the frozen, mutilated man, Howard clutched tightly to my shaking body, and I leaned over the edge of the slope, casting the torch downwards. "Please stay there," I weakly requested, eyeballing the statue beneath our feet. Terrifyingly, I did not feel fear for Dr. Crenshaw, but for my fleeing colleague and me. A feeling justified by the project leader's head snapping backwards. I nearly slipped over the edge, saved only by Howard's firm grip, as Crenshaw's face cranked upwards. Only there was no face left at all. "They're too small to be seen," the man whispered without a mouth, without vocal cords. "We enter their home and they enter ours." And Dr. Crenshaw's eyes, glazed and aimless like those that we had seen on Rachel, sat above a stretching opening in his face. What had once been his face. His mouth and nose had been consumed by that unstoppable, unseen mass. And then, when the wound eventually swallowed his eyeballs, Howard and I watched each of those tearful spheres turn into red and white mist swallowed like everything else by thin air. Only holes remained, cutting a tunnel from the front to the back of Crenshaw's head. The beam of my torch bored straight through to the other side for a drawn-out second, and then the man's body crumpled into a lifeless, near-skinless mound, much like Rachel. The two corpses would in little time at all become nothing more than mounds of bloody clothes. And then came skittering from the cave's bowels, a cacophony of overlapping skittering noises, which sounded to me like an untold number of feet, tiny, moving relatively to their mass at an unfathomable speed. Howard and I saw nothing of the sort, of course. They are too small to be seen. But the cave floor, 10 feet under our watching point on the staircase, started to darken as if some massive enormity were approaching. Battalions of things only visible once they had collected in immeasurable numbers. Scientific curiosity did not get the best of us. We did not wait to see the unknown things up close. Howard and I rushed up the spiral staircase, rushed at such speed that we nearly tripped over the sides, falling to our deaths. We ran until we were winded, and then we kept running, even as the skittering started to sound along the walls, pursuing us towards the stairwell's exit. But they did not follow us out of the top, did not follow us into the rainforest. We made it. We had collapsed, lungs deflated and bodies crying in pain, but we had made it. That was why it took me a few minutes to notice what was so out of place. I was still processing all that had happened. Howard wasn't breathing. I crawled over to his body, barely able to speak, and sobbed when I found him in the mud. I don't know how he had managed to run up the staircase. There was nothing left of him in the dirt but bones and a few remaining strips of skin on his skull. Tears soaking my skin, I unclipped Howard's rucksack from the back of his half-body, and the man haunted me one final time by twisting onto his back, twisting to face me. I didn't move him. He moved himself, moved on his own accord. The rest is little more than blurry blotches in my memory, a blur of physical and mental anguish. I'm amazed that I'm here to tell this tale at all. That in my state, I succeeded in scaling down the Inselberg's vertical side. That I made it to the airport and flew back to Paris and collapsed in my bed. Precisely 90 hours and 100 missed calls later, the adrenaline seems to have evacuated my system. It was only tonight that I found myself gripped by a fresh horror. I awoke in the middle of the night to the return of that unfixable itch. It was barely a tickle in the cave, but now I'm burning alive, but I'm so cold. I keep scratching, and with every fresh scratch, clumps of skin come away. Wounds form and they grow on their own. I am being consumed from the inside out, eaten by things too small to see. I don't know how those things escaped, but they did. Don't know how I survived so long while the others perished so quickly. How I made it down the mountain onto a plane and back to France. Except I do know. I know because I hear the chattering voices in my head. The voices which served that thing back in the cave. The thing which watched me from the dark. They did not kill me quickly because they wanted me to make it back to the world of mankind. Wanted me to transport them out of their cave. They needed a host, and now they are the explorers, discovering our world, our home, a place that for whatever reason, they weren't able to reach until I entered their den and carried them free. We enter their home and they enter ours. If I had known, I would have remained in that isolated sky forest to die, but it's too late now. You see, I noticed it on the plane, but I thought that I had lost my mind. Thought that I had simply been affected by the trauma of what I had experienced at the bottom of the stairwell. But I wasn't imagining things. The passengers started scratching their flesh. By the end of the flight, every last person on that flight was clawing irritably at their skin. It's out in the world now. You're not safe. Nobody's safe because they're too small to see. Too small and too quick. Forgive us for what we did. I'm sorry. Damon McCory, Rain, Big Country Allen, Smiling Cat, Jerry Ramey, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Mead